Hey kids, we're here today with a good friend, Magus, who is someone I have spent a lot of time talking with about various issues from philosophy to history and sociology, psychology, and probably, I don't know, cooking as well. Quite a lot of stuff. Very interesting guy, very insightful. You can check him out at journeyofthemagus.com where he blogs. He's also on Twitter. His handle is at Magus Journey there, and on Gab, and that is at Journey of the Magus. So, welcome, Magus. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. It's been a pretty long day. I'm learning to code at the moment and been doing my sort of weekend challenge from the course I'm doing, but feeling good. Feeling good.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely a multi-talented individual covering a lot of areas in a pretty short time. So glad to have you with us. So the reason that I wanted to chat with my friend here today is because Bret Weinstein, Jordan Peterson went together on the Joe Rogan podcast. And when that was announced, you and I were both very excited about this, and we're not disappointed at all. It was a fantastic podcast, very interesting to listen to. Really got at we kind of, I think we both followed both of those guys separately, as well as like being pretty good fans of Joe Rogan's general podcast as well, and having them all together was a pretty great intellectually stimulating experience, even longer than the average Joe Rogan podcast, if that can be imagined. So we wanted to take some time to kind of talk about what came out of that conversation. All right. So when you guys listened to it a little bit before I did. So I'm sorry that I had to make you wait before we talked about it some. But the big thing I know before you went in that you were wanting to get out of the conversation was Jordan Peterson has often talked about this idea of truth as respects religious texts, mostly religious texts, but some other things, right? Where he was saying, sometimes he'd say, "Oh, there's this stuff in the Bible that's true," and you and I were both atheists, right? We've never really been part of the atheist community or anything like that, but it was kind of a weird thing to hear when it first came out, right? It's like, what do you mean the Bible's true? Like the Bible has all kind, people live to 900 years. There's all kinds of nonsense in it. What does he really mean by that? And he hadn't really clarified before. He went on Sam Harris's podcast and they had some conversation about it, but they didn't really get at the root of kind of like, sort of definitionally, what does he mean? And Bret Weinstein was very deliberate about addressing that. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts about, what was your impression of what Peterson and Weinstein had to say about what it means for something to be, I think he called it metaphorically true, versus, I don't remember like factually true. Was that the other term they used?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Factually true or literally true and metaphorically true. Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. Ever since I first heard him talking about that, I was curious about what exactly he meant, and it seems like he's mostly nailed down, or is more Brett was giving out the words and Jordan was more sort of affirming them. I've noticed he's always a little skeptical or a little he sidelines the topic. He tries not to delve into it too much, but he like to explain exactly what he means. And at first I thought it was evasiveness, but more and more it just seems to be he's maybe not entirely sure. He feels like, I think maybe that it's hard to give the real words to describe it. But when he's talking about the metaphorically true, he seems to be talking about this idea. Essentially, he uses the word wisdom, which I guess we could use that as a synonym for metaphorically true. And in that sense, it's not such a strange concept. It's not too different from, say, what Aristotle says. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about how there's a lot of debate about what he means by this, but my interpretation, he says that you can take a student, they can do all the studying they like, but they won't be prepared for a study of ethics. And it doesn't matter if they're a young person or an old person. What matters is, as he says, if I recall the quote correctly, is if they're young in mind or young in their sort of basically their wisdom. If they don't have wisdom, and it's something that just can't be gained from. It's not a matter of sheer experience, and it's not a matter of sheer knowledge either. It's a certain application of the mind to one's experience, and perhaps also to one's knowledge as well. So that seems to be what he's getting at, this idea that there is something which it requires a struggle, it requires a battle with reality, it requires a real active engagement, and it requires an overcoming, which I suppose we bring in sort of German sort of philosophical thought. When you talk about like an overcoming it, maybe I'm throwing around buzzwords at this point, but when you've got someone like a sort of Hegelian idea that knowledge doesn't just come from a syllogism. There are certain types of knowledge which come from a sort of a looping back on yourself, or of going through a gestalt of going from here and learning this and through time and through experiences and through your actual engagement with the world, through things that you consciously do, the way the world looks to you shifts. And I think that's the core thing he seems to be getting at. That's where things start to get a bit where I diverge from him, because he's listening to his other podcasts and stuff. He's saying that the world as such changes, and he is adamant about. I mean, not the word adamant. He's explicit about this, that the world changes in the Kantian sense. He means that your way of viewing the world is structured by certain things, and the argument he makes about that is actually quite good. I quite like. There's certain aspects of that which I quite like. We can talk about that like in a bit, about utility and how your minds views the world through the lens of utility. But the idea is basically that you view the world with a certain structure, and as you start to engage with the world more and learn more about it, and as you go through certain trials, you actually change how the world looks to you. And he seems to be saying that particularly with religious truth, that when you have like a certain, maybe it's a religious experience that converts you, or maybe it's just you meet Jesus literally if you're a disciple, or living back in whatever time, like 0 AD, or I guess you'd call it 22 AD when he's running around. Whatever happens, you become religious and you have this thing, and suddenly it shapes the world, the way you see the world. The world literally is different. And I would say just that the world is different to you, but the thing he's saying is that truth, you can't really uncouple the two. That truth, the world just is shaped by these very deep, fundamental, metaphorical truths, and you really can't escape that, which, as I'm saying, is very deeply embedded in his view that rationality it evolved not as a way of discovering objective reality, but as a way of engaging with the world and surviving in it. And that's where he ties into sort of, as I said, into Bret Weinstein stuff as well, where Bret Weinstein's also making a similar point, that the rationality, reason, it's a utility function. It's there to survive, and the things that you have evolved, things that you've got, and certain ideas that have become means that travel down through society for millennia are things that are also good for survival or stability of society, but they don't necessarily reflect objective truths, but they are still true. And what truth means is they are useful. And I think he says that he says true in the sense of an axe, that an axe can be true, and to be a true axe, again, this is kind of Aristotelian as well, to be a true axe is an axe that is good at cutting, that performs its function well. So there is that second aspect of truth. And that's my sort of preamble and bit of a ramble on what I think was being said in the podcast.
Right. And it was Joe Rogan who brought up the suggestion of, like, why don't you just call it wisdom instead? And I don't like, there's something I don't like about using wisdom as the term, and I haven't quite put my finger yet on what it is, but I also don't like calling it truth, and I don't like calling it metaphorically true. If anything, I might call it like usefully true or something, or maybe even functionally true. Weinstein's example of the porcupine, I thought was a really, really good and clear one, right? Like, people believe that porcupines can throw their quills, that's not true, but it's a useful thing to believe because then you won't get hurt by a porcupine. And we probably have all kinds of things like this kind of built into us, both socially into us, but also, you know, evolutionarily speaking, like biologically built into us. And it seems too mild to call that wisdom, because especially since wisdom seems like wisdom is something you acquire, and to some extent I think some of these things aren't really acquired. I think some of them there's at least a sense in which you're born with them, or at least that I think the term should be able to capture both categories. So wisdom doesn't seem quite right, but at the same time calling it true, I understand it in the example with the axe. You know, I kind of understand I guess, what is it, like the etymological sort of root of the word, and how maybe in an historical context that made sense. But it still doesn't feel like quite the right terminology, because there is an objective reality. We seem to be capable of discovering that objective reality, but that just doesn't answer any questions for you about, okay, now what? Right? Or even if it's useful to you. Like there's a ton of stuff we could go learn about the world that's completely useless, or at least it's useless now, right? It might be useful, you know, 500,000 years from now. But, you know, they're in a sense, they're two separate things, but I don't know that they're two different types of truth. They might even be more separate than that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm wary. Yeah, I'm wary of calling it truth. I'm not so wary of calling it wisdom though, or calling it, yeah, wisdom. Like, it's the things they're talking about are they're this sense of, because they use the example of the porcupine thing, but that's just as an example to just build, like, to get the foot in the door, and it's not really, because what they're really talking about is like a religious truth is something like, well, religious truth, like as it's written, is something like, you know, Moses came down from the mountain and said this, or Moses, you know, went off to the Pharaoh and gave these warnings, and then this happened, and that, like the truth is that is that is the statement of the truth, and then contained within it is the wisdom of, like, sort of. So he talks about if the state becomes identified with a ruler, if the state just is the ruler, and how that leads to disarray, and that this is a repeated story within the Bible. So I mean, that's yeah, and I guess I'm not. I can see in calling that is wisdom. That's a wise thing, and it doesn't come from. But I suppose in a sense that's still a concept. Like, that's still just a conceptual thing. I mean, just because it's not a fact, it's still a conceptual thing that's just gained from experience, and from a number of experiences. I mean, maybe in this case it's told in an allegory and in a metaphor, and, you know, those stories tell something that we know is true, but we can also, well, we have the ability to record history now in a much more comprehensive way. We can, you know, I don't see any reason to do that any more than we should write history like Thucydides did. Like, that also uses a lot of plays fast and loose with the truth while still telling a kind of true story, you know.
Right, that's true. I mean, it's almost more true in the sense that it's more relevant, right? Because the details, the concretes are they're sort of stuck in time, right? I mean, that's what's so boring about a lot of naturalistic art, right? Or journalistic type art. It's like, for me, Great Gatsby, I mean, it has a few universal themes, but mostly it's very much like, this is about like a time and a place. And maybe that's sort of interesting, like a little bit, but it's nothing compared to like War and Peace, right? Which is like,
Yeah.
any human in any time is going to read this book and they are going to understand themselves and the world and the people around them better, like, period, no matter what. And I think that's the kind of lessons that maybe the good, I guess, or the useful, at least, religious truths that you get out of these stories. It's nothing to do with the concretes. It's not like, oh, watch out for a flood, right? And make sure you know how to build a boat. Like, it's okay, you know, be ready for catastrophe, because catastrophe is going to come. And you know, the person who prepares for that is the person who survives that. Okay, there we go. That's useful all the time.
Yeah. I think he's. I mean, it's interesting because he talks so much about, and that's where I wonder about like how necessary they are. Because sometimes I see what he's talking about, and it's very neat to me. I'm like, wow, that's cool. I'm like, why do you need the book to say that? But then maybe it's like, okay, so for instance, I'm thinking about the deluge, thinking about the flood, and I'm thinking, okay, it's he talks about how that tells you the deluge is representative of chaos. Water is often used throughout mythologies to represent chaos and the way things can be torn apart. And I'm like, okay, that's cool, but why do I need to know about, why do I need to believe in the story of the flood in order to know that? I mean, is it that I lack any better stories? Because why can't I just believe in a fictional story without believing in like a religious mythology of this? Why couldn't I just? It's very strange to me, like why that is. But the point he's making still, because he's not just making that up. He's saying it is necessary, and that people did believe in this stuff and find it very important, and today many people still do, and he's sort of trying to explain, because that's the thing that I'm on board with. I'm like, okay, I agree with you. This stuff's not. People didn't believe it because they were dumb. People weren't just stupid and believed this. They believed it because it provided a real utility to them. But I guess I get a bit lost on what that utility is. That, like, why is it that you have to really believe this stuff? Is that it? That it just doesn't sink in if you think it's fiction? It doesn't provide the utility if you think it's fiction and you say this is wisdom, but the story is false. Do you have to believe the story is for it to?
And I'm inclined to say no. I mean, it's a little hard to judge because I think there are complicated issues with, basically IQ, right? Like maybe there's a different answer for sort of different portions of the population to some extent because we are wired around stories, right? So it's clear that it helps for it to be a story. Whether it's a story that you know is fiction, I'm inclined to say I don't think it matters because I know an awful lot of religious people who take their religion quite seriously, and they don't necessarily think that the stories are literally true. Or even if they do, it's not particularly important. It's like I don't see them read the Bible and then read War and Peace, and then they get nothing out of War and Peace because they don't think it's literally true. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
So like, I think there's labeling it, making it the religion makes it central. It means everyone shares it, and it means you're supposed to take it seriously, and you're supposed to like really meditate on it, right? Like I like the points that Peterson has made in the past about prayer, right? The utility of prayer is like, well, some people pray, some people meditate, some people like contemplate, walk in a garden, think about a thing, whatever. They're all the same thing, right? And the point is you need to do this. So prayer is like a structured way of making sure that people do this. They take time to introspect. They take time to think before they act, like all kinds of different things like that, right? And it gets sort of distorted into this like, caricature, which does happen in the real world, right? Of people just like sitting in a room, like thinking about this thing and then never taking any action. Or just, like talking to God like they're writing a letter to Santa Claus or something like that. That definitely happens. And I think it comes back to something I think Weinstein talked about on the podcast actually about like the number of things that humans, I wish I could remember exactly how he phrased it, but it's something like there are a lot of things that humans knew implicitly before they actually knew it, for like explicitly, right? So we start acting in this way that allows us to survive, that is more or less in accordance with objective reality, right? Like once we learn the facts, it's like, oh, it's a good thing, Well, Rogan talked about the dietary restrictions, right? Like not eating shellfish. And that was one, I've heard that since I was a kid, right? It was like, here's all these kosher rules. Well, if you look at the kosher rules, an awful lot of them just kind of make sense if you're dealing with an environment where it was difficult to control hygiene with food, right? So foodborne illnesses were like a bigger deal. And if you just stay away from certain types of food, you're going to avoid a whole lot of problems. So that was contextually, now taking that as doctrine and doing that today doesn't make any sense. I'll just put it out there straight like that, because we know how to do it safely now, right? But the principle of like, we are going to do things we don't necessarily know why, but they seem to be
Yeah.
working, so we're going to keep doing them until we figure out why. That's like how we like have to go through the world, right? I mean, there's no other way for us to do it. And what's scary to me about people like Sam Harris and like the rationalistic atheist types, and to get myself in real trouble, a lot of objectivists, is they seem to think that, like they said on the podcast, like knowing all the facts means you'll know what to do. And then the flip side of that, which is really dangerous, which is if you don't know the facts, you don't know what to do. And that is wrong, and that is dangerous.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I also think it makes me think this stuff about like the religious people and the people who are very dogmatic. It makes me think that like in an ideal world, these people would all be atheists, but with like nice rational atheists. They wouldn't need any of this. But I keep thinking like I would at least settle for them just turning from a religion where the religion is just floating abstractions to a religion where they really believe in it because they believe it's useful, that they believe it's like something to be cherished because it provides life and it provides sustenance. It is real bread for them, and that there's something really useful. I love them to believe that it's necessary for life. And I guess that's what the point of like God is dead really is that this stuff just it's lost that. And so there's just no reason to really believe that it should be central in your life anymore. It makes me think of that. Yeah. And I agree on the thing about there's way too much of thinking that if you just have all the facts that you'll just like arrive at what you need to do, and that's weirdly, I don't know. It always makes me think of socialists. Like I always think I always hear that from actually sort of, or not socialists, but kind of people who are like borderline that they just want to control things because they think that we're going to, because it usually involves then instituting a system where the facts will be decided maybe by some supercomputer, and then it will spit out. And I'm like, if you think about it like that, well, any algorithm still has to be written, and it's still going to have its values about what is a good choice and what's not, what is a truth value and what's not. Like a machine doesn't still know that is the difference between a human and a machine, and that ethical component. There is something more there that sets the value of truth and of good in an ethical sense.
Right. And I think that this belief that the issue is facts comes up a lot in politics, because you constantly hear that from both sides, right? Like both sides think the facts are on their side, and to be a little Scott Adamsy about it, both sides are right. There are some facts on each side, right? The question is, which facts are relevant and how do you put them together? And I think if you are like Sam Harris, if you're kind of a midwit, or if you're someone just like who's like a middling intellectual but not like a real intellectual, then you end up in this environment where it really does look like the difference between the two sides is facts. And you'll see this tendency with people like this. God, it's such a big trend with these like fake historians on Twitter. I mean, I call them fake historians because even though they are technically historians, they don't have the slightest idea of what the study of history is actually about, right? Who like bury you under minutiae or details and concrete, right? And they think they've made a point by doing this because they can rattle off like, oh, here's this thing was found in this grave and blah, 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 and like this long list of things. And it's like, that's great, but that's not the question, right? The question is, what like generalizations can we legitimately draw like from all of this data, right? It doesn't mean they're not facts. It just means like they might not be meaningful facts, or they're not meaningful in isolation, or you have to have some way of like putting the facts into a hierarchy and turning that into like concepts and And then it's even another step from there to say, okay, now we're going to take what we figured out about this one era and try and apply it to another era, right? And they all like kind of totally fall apart and look like idiots when they try to do that. And when you, like you have, right, for part of your life, and like I have to some extent, you know, you spend time with like the really like high end sort of elite experts in any field. It really doesn't matter what field it is, right? But when you get to that level, everyone has the facts. Everyone has all the facts, and you still see
Yeah.
disagreement, like enormous disagreement. I mean, just like pull up, like look, the Marxists in academia, right, versus like the anarcho-capitalists in academia, or like there's like the whole. I mean, I know it leans mostly to the left and every like for various reasons, but you know the point is, there are plenty of these people, you know, like that. Like I've had these discussions with, and it's not ignorance of facts that leads them to have a completely opposite view from me, nor is it ignorance on my part of the facts, right? Like they just, that is, facts are important. I don't mean to say that they're not important, and they can definitely change your mind. You can absolutely be missing a key fact that will completely flip your perspective, but it's not like the answer, right? Like when you get to these like really significant issues, like big human problems, like it doesn't all hinge on just dissemination of like raw facts.
Yeah, and like the big import for me in that is, or export or whatever. The big thing about that is you want to. Well, there's two things. One is okay, like how do we then have a good argument with people? How do we convince them of things? Or maybe that's not a good question. So I can see a more clear answer to that. But I guess it's really how do I make sure that I'm being a good seeker of the truth if I know that I could have all the facts and still be wrong? And I suppose part of that is just a good learning system, a good system for approaching facts, like knowing how to approach a topic and how not to just get focused on irrelevant details, and how to actually really learn something and not just repeat back answers. And part of it's also like a good conceptual framework and a good ability. And I suppose also it's biases as well. It's a matter of making sure that you're very aware of biases, and I think also being aware. This is where I think the thing loops back a bit to the idea of truth. There's a as a utility function, and also as a social thing that our rational mind is, you know, it evolved to navigate the world in order to survive, and it also evolved primarily to begin with as a way to navigate a social world. So we have to really be very careful and very aware that our ability to look at objective reality is like a secondary thing, and it requires focus. It really requires us to like do some hard work to kind of tune it and make sure it's working.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And it also seems to be only possible in limited areas and limited contexts, right? Which is why it's so common to see scientists who are very good at objectivity in their specific discipline say like utterly retarded stuff about politics or about you know things in the social sciences or something like that. I mean, it's a very refined skill, and we have a limited capacity to deploy it. And I think so. Stefan Molyneux has talked about man, this was like this was one of those scary like evolutionary psychology sort of things to learn. But you know, talking about navigating a social environment, you know, there's a lot of time in history, and it's not necessarily over. As I learned, where you know if you thought, or more importantly said, the wrong thing, that, and I mean not a false thing, but a socially wrong thing, that may well be a true thing, that you would die because people would kill you. Right? I mean, at best they would ostracize you. Then maybe you have a chance, you know, a la like Ayn Rand's Anthem, right? Maybe you can go out in the woods and somehow survive on your own because you're so objective and rational. But more likely they'll you know Lord of the Flies you and bash your brain in on a rock. And we're evolved to deal with that. And the primary way we're evolved to deal with that is to be very careful about what we say around people. We're not, I mean, there are some ways in which we're wired to seek the truth, but there are a lot of competing programs, you know, built into us. And I think it's admirable to want to, you know, be as truth seeking as possible. But I think it's naive to think that that is somehow something that we're naturally suited for, to the point that we, I guess, don't need to take seriously these innate challenges.
Yeah, and like particularly, yeah. I mean, I think I really enjoy reading the less like. Do you ever visit Less Wrong?
Sometimes,
They have
yeah.
like a yeah. I like their list of biases there, and the things they're talking about also sort of grounded in. I mean, there's nothing particularly original there. It's a lot of just coming from sort of other books. But yeah, like particularly just thinking about, you have to think very carefully about, well, this is where the evolutionary history stuff becomes very interesting, where it's the stuff about why is it easier for you to believe certain things than others.
When I think that illustrates something that really popped out to me in the whole Joe Rogan conversation, that it's not just needing to use like all these different almost mental tactics within your own mind, but you also need other people's minds, because these questions that we're really interested in answering, right? Like how do you prevent another Hitler, or how do we deal with like violence like in the population, right? None of these really like big human problems, as I've taken to calling them, none of them can be answered from one perspective or by one discipline. And the reason that conversation, even though Jordan Peterson's gone on Joe Rogan by himself, Weinstein's gone on it by himself, they're great podcasts, but the reason why this one was so cool is because each of those guys on their own, as smart as they are, they have holes, right? Like they have things that they don't understand about these big problems, because they're focused in one area, and they have to be because we're human and we have that
Yeah,
limitation, right? And when you put them all together, you suddenly go from feeling like maybe I got like half the picture, to being like, ooh, I've got like 80% of the picture, right? And you need to keep adding those in. I mean, it's one of the things that has always rubbed me the wrong way about the field of sociology, because I always felt like sociologists were trying to define a discipline that was in reality a whole bunch of other smaller disciplines, and they wanted to be able to say like we're the discipline that solves big human problems, right? When they're not, and they
yeah.
can't be. What you actually need is, what they needed in that conversation. We have the evolutionary biologist in Weinstein, very helpful. We have the psychologist in Jordan Peterson. It would have been really helpful to have a philosopher, right? Because when they're stumbling around
Uh,
this question of truth, it's because like Peterson understands his philosophy, Weinstein clearly does as well, but they're not philosophers, and if they had one there, I think it would have helped. And then similarly,
yeah.
they start talking at one point about different problems with a free market, right? And I'm sort of an economist, I guess, by training, and I was like gritting my teeth listening to it, because I'm like, oh, if you guys just had an economist on here, they could have easily pointed out like where you're going awry, right? And they weren't even all wrong about it. I mean, it's like, yeah, you're like 80% of the way toward understanding this real problem that exists, but when it goes for that final 20% where you're trying to move toward a solution, like you're missing real basic stuff that anyone trained in that field, not real basic, but like anyone trained well in that field like would have caught. And we need to figure out these cooperative ways of like bringing different resources together to solve these problems in a decentralized manner, right? Like
Yeah.
like these podcasts, like the conversation we're having now. And that's where you kind of get back to like, yeah, we really need free speech, because like that's like a life or death issue, like right there, right? I mean, it's our very ability to solve life and death issues that free speech protects. Sorry,
That's
I
exactly
just
what I
hit
was
a
going
lot
to.
of topics right there.
Yeah, no, no, no. That's exactly what I was going to say. Actually, as you starting like going down that road, I was thinking you talk about multidisciplinary approach, and like yeah, exactly. It's so vital. I mean, like notwithstanding that, yes, there is a certain bias where you get a bunch of people together, and maybe there's like one person will maybe force other people to agree with them just through the force of their character, or maybe someone will just like there's a social pressure to conform. Those things notwithstanding, they're on the whole, I think getting people together, getting them talking, that's how we can sort of check each other. So long as you haven't got like a malevolent actor who's trying to sort of throw things off and trying to use sort of sly tactics to mess up the discussion and sort of throw a wrench in the works. But otherwise, I think like yeah, and that's why free speech is so vital.
Well, that
I
malevolent
was
actor is even one of the problems that we need to solve, right? And that we need free speech to solve. And that's a big area that I think, culturally we've been missing for a long time. People, at least in America, like we're too nice. We're way too nice. And we've stopped transmitting generation to generation the tools to deal with malevolence of various kinds. Because no one wants to be
yeah,
the
I think
bad guy now who says, this person is a bad person and needs to be dealt with.
yeah, and I think it's even just identifying that it's bad because it's easy to say when someone's punching a kitten that person's bad or when it's stealing someone's wallet. But it's harder to say when they're engaging in a type of discussion which is dishonest, when they're not just telling a lie and saying that Mars is made of cheese. They're when they are being doing something, but speaking in a way that's dishonest and that's they're bringing in abstractions without really tying them in or whatever. Like that kind of that stuff is malevolent and people do it, and I'm aware of people who they do it. I'm having a tough time sort of maybe nailing down like a concrete example, but it's hard for us to really talk about that just because it's maybe a bit harder to describe. I guess it's less perceptually obvious. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes some, experience and wisdom in order to pick up when that's happening. And it's a lot harder to gain that kind of wisdom when people don't talk about it. So speaking of bad actors, there was a big other topic on the podcast besides, everything
Yeah.
under the sun. So they spent some time talking about Charlottesville and talking about some of the fallout that happened from that. So if you haven't listened to the podcast, Jordan Peterson was supposed to be on a panel at Ryerson University, as was Faith Goldie. And because of some circumstances surrounding the Charlottesville event, that was canceled, mostly because of Faith Goldie. And I don't like phrasing it that way, because, it's not because of her per se. But she did lose her job at the Rebel Media, and the reason she lost her job is because post Charlottesville, right? She went on some podcast, and I don't know anything about it, but apparently it's pretty far right, or maybe not right, depending. There's the whole are Nazis on the right or not
Yeah.
debate at the moment, but so she went on this I guess too extreme podcast and acted purely as like a journalist reporting, what she had heard and didn't offer any criticism or pushback against them, something like that. And that was deemed insufficient or inappropriate, even though she was doing it in her capacity as a private individual. So she lost her job and the panel was postponed. And maybe she doesn't get to be on it, I'm not sure. So they talked some about this, and I definitely wanted to cover this with you because, love these guys, love all three of them, but I think we need to push back and give criticism where it's due. And I definitely think in this conversation, this part of the conversation, it kind of came up twice in the podcast, but these parts of the conversation, I think some failings appeared with all three of them, actually, in terms of how they were thinking about it, which isn't a big surprise in my opinion, because we know that all three of them are on the left, not extreme left, and there are people on the left who are standing up against the bad elements on the left. So I don't mean that as a way to condemn them or anything like that. But they Peterson talks a lot about how personality types kind of influence your political direction, and they influence a lot more than that. So it kind of makes sense that if you're the type that fits on one side versus the other, it'll impact you, right? I don't exactly want to go so far as to call it a bias, because I don't know if it's exactly fair to call it a bias, but it will change the way that you view and judge events, or even how closely you view it, which was my main first negative reaction. I think it came up with something Joe Rogan said, where he was like, oh, these guys were chanting anti-Semitic slurs. And then he was like, well, actually, I don't know like what they were chanting. I've heard different reports, but in any event, Nazis.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, just not a lot of investigation into the actual facts. And then you kind of get into that truthiness question again of like, how much do the actual facts matter versus how much does it matter just what the public's perception of the event was. And and then which facts matter, and you could kind of go down that rabbit hole all day. But I would have liked to have seen a little bit more attempts to say objectively, like what was it? Like I think one of them mentioned like the KKK was there, and I have yet to see any evidence that that's correct. I don't know if you've seen something different.
I've not seen any evidence of that. No, as far as I'm aware. I mean, because the thing is, there's two different things that get conflated together. There's the Tiki Torch, which was alt-white, I guess is the proper term to use. A bunch of alt-white guys, Richard Spencer and that lot. I can't remember if Richard Spencer himself was actually there. I think he was.
He was, yeah.
But it's that, yeah, and they're what we would, I guess, in our private discussions, we've called with capital with proper noun, like capital letters at the beginning, literal Nazis, because they do like to call themselves Nazis or play and dress up as one, or as it's that kind of Daily Stormer thing where it's like they play fast and loose with how they're perceived and they don't really want to be nailed down to whether they're joking or not. So there was that lot, but that was peaceful, and that was all, and that was just fine, and they didn't do anything. And there seems to be this idea that maybe Trump should have condemned them for just assembling. And then there's the next thing, the next day, where, well, there's then two other things there. There's the sort of rally itself, which was a mixture of people, and there was one guy with a Nazi flag, and then most of them were just a mix of alt-white and alt-light and maybe actual alt-right people, like a whole mix. It's not really clear. There's a whole bunch of different other people. There was left and Antifa doing their usual thing of encircling them and lobbing stuff about and illegally assembling, by the way, when they didn't have the right to be there. And then, of course, there is also the car incident itself, which at the time it wasn't clear what happened, and I think still now it's not clear. I mean, it's really, I don't have all the facts about it, but as far as I'm aware, the facts mostly point to the guy just panicking after being surrounded and driving people down. Either way, but they've gone from those three distinct things: the alt-white at their peaceful rally, the mixture of people at mostly peaceful rally where the alt-left were being all starting to get violent and testy, and then also this guy whose political affiliation is unclear, and it's not clear why he did what he did or like what the exact events are surrounding that. And then that's all just compressed into alt-right Nazi violence, and it's right to punch them for that, because they say at one point it's all Bret says it's all right to attack someone if they're going after your way of life. So he seems to think even if they're,
I noticed that too. That was interesting.
And
I could punch an awful lot of people in that case.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm like, well,
I'm an
okay,
ANCAP,
anyone
just
who
to
wants
be clear, yeah. Like anyone who supports the state, I can punch now. Cool.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Exactly. Like, look, like that. Yeah, that's the thing I find so ironic in all this. When they're talking about, punchy Nazis, I'm like, do you know what? We've been talking for decades about the parallels between the Weimar Republic and sort of modern day America, and frankly, the people who are advocating all these socialist policies aren't all that different. Like, can I go attack them now? Is that all right?
Yeah, and there was also the portion of the conversation where Jordan Peterson talked about how his colleagues were critical of him working with the business school, and Bret slows him down and is like, well, let's give their argument its due, and they get into this stuff about like some problems with capitalism, and I approve of that discussion 100%. But then we get into this discussion of Charlottesville, and it's like, well, they're all basically Nazis or something like that, or they're neo-Nazis in the KKK. It's like, okay, like, I know more about this than I would like to, but like, none of these people are neo-Nazis. Like 100% zero are what that term actually means. Neo-Nazis are more or less like prison gang, and they actively
Right.
hate white nationalists like Richard Spencer. I don't know a lot about them, but I just know that much. They don't come to these events, right? Then there's white nationalists, and it's like, if you're a white nationalist, are you a Nazi? Well, no. I mean, in this common parlance sense, like maybe kinda, I guess I see what people mean, but Nazi has a whole bunch of other stuff that comes with it that doesn't necessarily attach to white nationalism. If you oppose white nationalism, fine, but it's like, properly identify it and you know, kind of deal with the issues, instead of this sort of isolate, attack, and destroy a tactic that, like, you know, I just don't think it's going to work long term, I guess. And then, like you pointed out, the daytime event in Charlottesville was much broader coalition of the right. I mean, it certainly was further toward the Nazi end of things than most of those events, right? There have been a lot of Unite the Right rallies, and many of them have been very, like, center right. Right. Some of them have been like 100% alt-light, as you would say, you know, just generic Trump supporters, whatever. That brand is a very, like, just generic, like, typical right/Republican type of thing. This particular event in Charlottesville happened to be one that the more extreme elements on that side targeted. And were allowed to join. So, I mean, targeted maybe sounds different than exactly what I mean. But the point is, a lot of them were there. So yeah, it was a more extreme event. Was it a neo-Nazi rally? No. Was the KKK there? No. The one dude with the Nazi flag is the only person who hasn't been doxxed, basically. And, like, what does that tell you? I mean, his face wasn't covered. And it was literally one guy. Like, no one has found a single other person who has it, right? And yeah, I don't mean to trivialize that. I don't like that happened. I think the organizers should have been more careful about it. But, you know, if we're gonna tiptoe around and say, you know, these people who are like seething with bigotry against business just because it's business and because they're Marxists, and we're going to be very carefully give their arguments their proper due and proper understanding, then why are we turning around and just saying, like, well, you know, here was these, like, neo-Nazis and KKK and, like, maybe some normal people, I don't know, but Trump should have condemned them as being just as bad as the people who had flamethrowers and, you know, who tried to kill me and my husband and all this other stuff. I mean, it's just like, you know, it seems like even with the people who push back against the left, almost no matter where you go on, the only person I can think of maybe is, like, Sargon of Akkad. He's going to be, like, he's probably not the only one, but the only one who's a pretty significant figure that I can think of. The only person who I think is, like, genuinely objective about the degree of, like, bad behavior and violence between the two sides, right? It's like, yeah, okay, I get that the policies that some of these people are advocating on both sides will lead to violence, maybe on a similar scale. But that hasn't been our standard for a long time, right? Like, every statist policy means violence. So you can't tell me that's your standard, because if that's your standard, you shouldn't engage in politics at all. You should just be punching people, like, left and right, like I was saying earlier, right? So you can't tell me that it's about that. And you also can't look at this and say, you know, it's like, you... Like, I get it, because yes, this woman died in the car accident, and, you know, to some extent it was just luck that the right side, let's say, killed someone before the other side. And like we said, the facts are still out. We still don't know exactly what happened. And I don't mean to sound like I'm being callous or anything. It's just the victim's mother has said that she died of a heart attack. And there's some video that shows she wasn't even hit by the car. Doesn't mean that the car in the accident was an approximate cause. But like you said, it may not even be a criminal act, because a car accident isn't necessarily criminal, right? Depending on what happened. And we just don't know at this point. So on the other hand, you know, we know things like the guy at the Milo at Cal event in Berkeley who ended up with 12 fractures in his skull face down in the street. And what happened to me and my husband, right? We know the story with that. We know those were people on the left. We know that they did something that could have easily killed us and they didn't care. And we know that many more people were involved in doing that than one guy driving a car. And, you know, even if it was deliberate, even if it was terrorism, it's not coordinated in the way that these other attacks have been coordinated. So I'm honestly, I'm pretty sick of like playing this game of like, and then Trump goes and says that both sides are equally bad. And that's still not enough, right? Like even Jordan, Bret, and Joe all on the podcast thought that Trump said the wrong thing because, well, it was an interesting reason why, right? It was basically because the woman died and because this was proximate. right? Like this just happened. And I thought that was funny too, because it's like, you guys kind of sound like old people there a little bit to me, because it was actually in Trump's third statement on the issue that he pointed out the bad behavior on the left.
Yeah, first thing he
Right?
did was get up and say, "Oh, I denounce. Oh, this is awful. What's happened?" That was his immediate
Yeah.
response.
And then there was another one where he said a similar thing. And then finally, in the third one, when people were still clamoring, and yeah, that was less than a week later. But like, this is the internet age,
That's when he
people.
was
Like, 5 days later is a long time later.
Yeah, wasn't he the context that he? I mean, I might be wrong about this. I thought the context was that he was asked specifically about the violence. Someone brought it up, and so he responds to the point of violence as such.
Right.
Like,
That's
who's
also
the
true.
perpetrator?
Yeah, that's also true. He didn't prepare a statement and go out and say, okay, now it's been 5 days and I want to talk about how bad the left is. It was a reporter who was doing their usual thing, right? Asking him 14 times to disavow David Duke or whatever, doing that kind of thing. And, him getting fed up with it and being like, what about the alt left? Or define alt right, or like talk about this, whatever. I thought it was brilliantly and perfectly handled. Now, of course, I have the complete opposite bias as Bret and Jordan and Joe on this, so it makes sense that I would see it more in that frame. But I think it's hard to justify their reaction to it. And honestly, I felt the same way about Jordan's comments on Faith Goldie. He talks about how he listened to the interview with his son. He's like, we listened to it very carefully, trying to figure out what she did wrong. And I kind of thought it was funny, because it was like, that sounds like you're describing like rationalizing her firing, right? Or rationalizing her getting kicked off. And it's like the reason he came up with why people might be mad at her was plausible, but that going back to like truth, right? Like, but does that mean that was right? Right? Like, does that like the he basically, his basic claim was like, if you're going to go and talk to Nazis, you need to at least, the minimum requirement is you get one zinger in or something like that. Right? And it's like, what is this rule? Like if you're a journalist, right? Like, let's say you're an investigative journalist. Let's say you're an undercover cop, right? Like, you don't get the zinger in until the end, right? Like, you infiltrate the KKK or whatever for like years, potentially pretending to be their friend, not challenging anything they do, and then in the end you expose them. Like, that's how that's done sometimes. You don't know that isn't part of it. Like, Faith Goldie is like a quite religious woman. I think it's pretty unlikely that she's like oblivious to like the evils of the Nazis. For example, I mean, like, Hitler wasn't the biggest fan of Catholics, right? And she's Catholic. So it's like, I don't know, like at some point I'm just kind of like, or maybe she was just doing her job in the best way that she knew how, and all this policing, right? This carefully wanting to draw boundaries, like they talk about, right? Like the right is good at excluding their extremists and the left isn't, because in general the right is good at drawing boundaries, which is why we want to build a wall. Okay, fair enough. But so then you come to this analysis and you're kind of saying, okay, here's where the boundaries should be drawn, but we can look over at countless examples on the left and where they'll never draw that boundary. And you guys don't have a conversation about it. You have a conversation about Faith Goldie.
You mean boundaries as in like, because what I was thinking about was like, she sits down with a Daily Stormer, but if someone sits down with a Marxist, they're never expected to, throw in a challenge. But it is awful, all the people Mao killed and Stalin killed. They're never expected to bring that up.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, and they talked about, like why does that happen? Why doesn't communism have like the visceral reaction? And Joe thought that it was basically all indoctrination, which I think is a plausible theory. And then was it Jordan or was it Bret who thinks it's like he was like the Nazi like punches you and steals your wallet, and like the communist is like the white collar criminal. I thought that was pretty funny, because like I don't know. I mean, the Nazis seem pretty white collar in a way, like a lot more than Che Guevara does.
Yeah, they're very much. I mean, it's very obvious what they do, but there is also very much a silent efficiency to it that I guess. But I don't know. It made me. I mean, this is what I was mentioning in sort of the notes that like it made me think of the RK thing, that because you were talking about with healthcare back in your video about that being a sort of an arcade thing where people are like, do they want free healthcare where it's all equal and people die according to rules, or do they want free healthcare as in like free, like you don't pay for it, or free healthcare as in like private healthcare as in where people will die, but it's just a random fact of your luck and stuff, and it's circumstances. There isn't a rule that says that you must die because of this. I guess it makes me think of that slightly, where it's like Nazis are a bit more on the. I don't want to say that they're more case selected, but they're a bit more maybe on that wolf end of things, where it's like the communists, they seem kind of a bit more okay, at least if you are selected, because they seem kind of like they just want to. There's a system, there's the rules, and the rules you can get burned by them, but hey, you know, it's the rules, it's all equal and fair. And with Nazis, it's kind of a bit more like they're gonna go target someone, and it's not fair, but they're gonna target them, but it's gonna make things okay. Maybe I'm being a bit fast and loose with that, a bit vague, but that there was something in that that sort of struck me as a certain analogy. At least on the socialist side, but maybe it doesn't apply to the Nazi side, but certainly on the socialist side, why socialism seems to get away with it on that white collar thing.
Right. Right. I think, yeah, I don't know. I maybe I need to read up on it a little bit more, but it's an interesting question because, you know, the big thing on the K side is like, you like competition, and it seems pretty obviously true that Nazis are a fan of intergroup competition, although then they try to control it in this way that is in a sense anti-competitive, right? Like it's not like they armed the Jews and were like, let's go at it, right? So that might be more like true K or something like that.
Yeah.
But there's still something, you know, I can see as competitive about it. Like it's our group gonna go fight these other groups, right? And then within the group, the socialism was meant for within the group. So within the group, we're, you know, maybe not so much with the competition, but that's because we're focused on this competition with the out group right now. Like maybe, I mean, that's sort of the frame on the Nazis, I think, where people put them on the right. And I'm still learning quite a bit about that regime. And, you know, sometimes I learn stuff that makes me think like, wow, like they really were just like your standard issue, like globalist, socialist, you know, type of characters. And then, some, you know, other times you learn something where you're like, oh, yeah, maybe they were maybe the nationalism was a little stronger than, you know, than I thought before, or something like that. As opposed to, you know, even though there was a lot of murder, a lot of death on the socialist side, say with like Russia or something like that, it is more of that. It does seem to be more of that like rabbit type, right? It doesn't have anything to do with competition, really. It has to do with, well, like you said, I guess kind of these weird notions of equity or something like that. Yeah. I would like to be able to just say that they're both terrible and tell them both to fuck off, but definitely as a culture we seem much more sure about one of them being terrible than the other, and that's a tough position to be in. In fact, that brings me to, you know, what I think the first thing maybe or second thing I said to you after I listened, which hadn't occurred to me before. So Jordan Peterson has his famous, I think at this point, thing about, you know, clean up your room. So his sort of antidote to what's going on right now, one of them is to encourage people to focus on themselves, right? So don't go out and try and change the world when your room is still a mess, right? Clean your room, get your life in order, take care of yourself, take care of your family, then maybe look at taking care of people around you, take care of your community, then maybe you can look at the big picture stuff, right? And in a lot of ways, that's a great message. But here's what I thought was interesting. He talks a lot about what put someone on, at least the fascist sort of right. You know, not like Nazis are, you know, high in orderliness, right? Like conscientiousness is the big five trait, but then within that there's orderliness and industriousness, and they're very high in orderliness, and that's the main predictor there, right? So what type of person sounds more likely to be interested in cleaning their room to you? A person who's high in orderliness, or a person who has the opposite of that?
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah, so it does.
wonder, yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, I like, so what I wonder is if the advice that he's giving, while it's good advice, is far more likely to be taken by people who are on the right than on the left. I have a hard time seeing someone who's currently, blue haired, like doesn't bathe, hairy armpits, moldy locks, whatever, who's out there throwing bottles with Antifa, suddenly sitting up and being like, I should clean my room, But I can see some of these fashy haircut guys marching with tiki torches or whatever, saying like, okay, you have a point, I better settle down and make some white babies and take care of my family and that sort of thing. And so does that just is all that's going is my fear is that while it's good advice, potentially all that it could serve is to further leave the left unchecked and defang the right even more than they are now. And we'll end up in the same state of unbalance that we're headed toward and that Peterson fears. And I think and I also wonder if he feels more comfortable with giving the advice this way because some part of him knows this, but it comes back to just like the Nazis are somehow scarier. Even though, looking at it rationally, probably they shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I think he does. I mean, he literally says he is trying to reach out more. I think he says that he's trying to reach out more to the right than the left. And it's these young guys who are sort of Kekistanis. They're the ones that he says he's trying to reach out to them, and he talks about worrying about being associated with them as being seen as one of them. He says that's kind of the risk he takes. So I think when he says that that's the risk he takes, I think that means that those are the people he's after. So the question is then, what? I don't think there's any doubt. I think your premise is correct that those people are then taken out of the fight if they pursue that. The thing for me is, like, firstly, I'm kind of like wondering how valuable are they to the fight if their room isn't even in order, so to speak. If they,
good point.
Like, I want the best possible people on our side, and often when I look around, I'm looking at these people. There's people willing to get out and march in the street and shout and get into fights, but I'm like, do I even want that? And what is the end goal? In the end, I'm just thinking like, okay, yeah, I'm going to help avoid the situation Dr. Peterson's worried about, but I mean, do we believe that it's avoidable at this point? Like, I just keep thinking, well, maybe we should just be making sure that our side is in order as best as possible, that we are psychologically as strong as we can, that we are, we're basically, psychological and philosophical prep, that we're making sure that we are prepared for the hard times ahead. I'd rather do that than if the fight really is, it just can't be won and we're heading, we'll just get ready for it and we're strong.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine how taking Peterson's advice would make an individual weaker or less effective, right? Or almost no matter what your goal is, which is why I think the advice works for either side. It's just a question of who's going to take it. So, yeah, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I try to imagine someone on the left taking the advice, and all I can think is that they would end up veering towards the right because they would just end up more people. Their amygdala wouldn't be triggered, be just a bit more kind of rational. So they'd be more reality oriented.
Yeah, something like that. All right. Well, I think we covered a pretty good range of stuff there, and in only 1/3 the time that it takes Joe Rogan. So learn a lesson, Joe.
Wow.
I'll teach you about podcasting, most successful podcaster in history. Anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
I suppose I don't want to dig too deep into dig up anything. I think one thing I just wanted to loop back on was the thing about journalism and the thing about sort of what Faith Goldie should have done, and that idea of journalism as being argumentative or being as attacking. I just don't quite get where that comes from, because it's like this to go back to the idea about like free speech and the idea that truth comes from multidisciplinary approach and of having all these voices talking together and working together, like surely that's what you want. You want to expose things, and whether it's good or bad, you want to get voices out there. And you don't have to be condoning this stuff, but you can say, if you know, this is what the Daily Stormer guys think, and I'm giving them their best possible case. And now it enters into thing. It seems very funny that he talks about the sort of how postmodernists believe it's all about power games and just, you know, the truth will never out. It's just going to be who's powerful. And then he talks about the fear that if an idea is presented and it's unchecked, then the power of it might just be so overpowering that it'll, you know, it'll have an outsized influence in the debate. I think we should just, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Generally.
And I also noticed what seems like the best word I can think of for it is maybe like a latent totalitarianism. But just it seemed like these really small sort of hints at like, well, we have this programming in us and we have these things that can help us predict, you know, are we heading toward genocide or this or that or these behaviors? And it's like this big question mark still, like, okay, so let's say you predicted a genocide is coming, then what do you do about it? And I don't know, I have nothing more than sort of a feeling, I guess, to back it up, but I had this sense of sort of hanging in the air of like the boot of the state, right? Like stepping on the human face, 1984 style, like in parts of that conversation, because it's kind of like, well, what else are you gonna suggest? You know, like what else?
Yeah.
Like if it is like these you know, to some extent these ideas are dangerous, or there's some different things that will like trigger like this behavior in people, like awaken it in people, then what? Like what do you do about it? And to me, what you do about it is you bring it into conscious awareness, right? And I've had this experience like so many times in the past 2 years, I've probably lost count, but like there have been so many things that I did, like actual actions that I took, like eating is a good example, actually, right? Like emotional eating, I'd always heard was a thing. I never believed that I did it. Until I don't remember who I heard it from, but I got more insight into like actually understanding sort of the mechanism and recognizing different things about it. And then I realized, oh, here's a bunch of instances where I do that. And from understanding how that actually looked to solving the problem for me, like it took like a week. You know, I mean, I'm not saying it's always going to be that easy for everybody. And, you know, maybe I have some things helping me like do these things more easily, but it's like as soon as you know that, like, you know, it's not like your true self telling you to do this thing, it's, you know, this chemical process in your body right? Or it's this like, or it's your gut bacteria or whatever it is. Like, I know we don't know a lot about it, but the more we know about it, the more it's like you just make that thing conscious, and like half the time at least it just goes away without you even really having to do anything else. At least that's been my experience. So in a sense, I don't find these things as scary. I mean, like, it's scary right now where it's like, we know it's a thing and we're not that good at predicting it yet. That sucks. But that's the place that we're in basically all the time as humans, right? And we're not going to get better at it if we gravitate toward these totalitarian type solutions.
Which I guess is part of this. It's this thing that they're identifying them with. It's possible for a person to do something, and then there's the real accepting that you are a person who does that thing. Which I guess is where Dr. Peterson's stuff about like considering your shadow self. I mean, it doesn't have to just be. You have to just consider all the range of options and that you could be. Like, could you be a non-guard at an extreme? But also, there's this thing, emotion eating. People exhibit it like this, and to actually not just floating away. Yeah, maybe that could apply to me. Blah 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 blah. But to actually examine yourself and just really consider for a moment: does that apply to me? what would it look like if it applied to me? What would I be like? And then to start to realize, oh, I guess I would do that, and those behaviors are similar to mine. That does seem to be a core part of wisdom and of realizing what different actions you need to take. Because I know, like, I've had so many instances like that, things where it's like there is an unhealthy behavior, like that sounds bad. I will, and then I'm like, I don't think I do anything like that. And to start thinking, well, okay, I mean, I do this and I do this, and then I'm like, well, maybe maybe I am exhibiting that, and to have to really think. Sometimes it's a matter of that thing of the pragmatic of believing something before knowing why it's true. It's sometimes I think it's important to believe something is true before you actually accept it. Or before you make a decision on whether it's true. Sometimes it's good, I think, to live as if something were true, and then to see what the consequences of that are, and then to decide, okay, well, the consequences of this, and I've decided that is not true about myself. Believing that doesn't actually yield anything useful. Oh wow, yeah, by believing that about myself, I realized that actually I've identified things I can change and ways I could be happier.
Don't we all want to be happier?
Yeah.
Actually, we probably don't all want that, but we should.
Yeah, which was another point that this up, which was really fascinating. But that would open a whole other can of worms. That the whole thing says about how we think we're pursuing happiness, but really we're pursuing opportunity. And as soon as that opportunity yields some sort of benefit, we push ourselves into some state of want and desire and of net negative, and it starts a whole new cycle.
Yeah,
I found that fascinating.
I'm definitely guilty of that at times. Well, so thank you very much for an enlightening conversation. Everyone listening out there, hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't checked out the Bret Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, and Joe Rogan podcast on Joe Rogan, you should definitely go check it out. It's amazing. Listen to it before you listen to this, because otherwise our rambling here probably doesn't make any sense. Should have said that at the beginning. Thanks a lot, Magus.
Cool. No worries.